we're going to jump in to techniques. So the handout looks something like this. It talks about different techniques. We're going to go through those. I want to encourage you to try it out with me. We're going to kind of do examples as we talk about each of them. If you aren't able to kind of follow along and try them out with us as we're going through, use this time to kind of take notes and watch. But I want to encourage you to try it out at some point. I shared earlier that we can watch all the videos and look at all the pictures and read all the descriptions and get that knowledge. But there's really no substitute for trying it out and actually feeling how the brush feels when you're pushing it in the water, or seeing what the water can do when you put the pigment to it. So I definitely want to encourage you to, if you're not trying it out with us now, to try it out at some point for sure. So this handout will kind of be walking through. The supplies that I'm going to be using today are going to be my pigment. So I've got my pan palette here that already has the colors in it. And I have my larger palette that has the pigment tubes that I've added to it. I'm going to be flip-flopping between the two, so you can kind of see what both of them can do, but also to illustrate that whatever pigment you have, you can use to create whatever it is we're going to be creating. So I'm just going to be flipping between the two to kind of illustrate that. I also have a variety of brushes that I'm going to be using today. I have two brushes that came in pan palettes like this, a small round brush and a small flat brush. And then I have some more brushes that I'll be using today too. Another round brush and a flat brush. These are brushes that I bought separately. And I'm just going to be kind of going between all these brushes, again, to illustrate that you can use whatever supplies that you have to create these paintings. Like I said, we're going to be kind of going through these different techniques today, and some of them require layers to dry before we can add to them. So we may be kind of jumping around a little bit, but I'll make it very clear which technique we're working on. Okay, so now that we've got our supplies out, we've got our pigment is kind of soaking in that water right now. I have some cards here I want to kind of go through as we do our process. So this first one that we're going to do is the flat wash. And a flat wash technique is one color that is brushed across the surface. There's no change, no variation in the color. It's one flat, solid color, right? And so you can see in my example here that there's no variation, right? You don't see the brush strokes on the inside. It's one wash of color. And so that's the flat wash. Now, when I'm doing watercolor, and I bet other people who do watercolor full time will tell you this too, that you're not intentionally thinking about these different techniques, like, oh, this process I'm doing glazing, or this one I'm doing feathering or a flat wash. But you'll find yourself hopping between several different techniques in the while you're doing that painting. And the reason it's helpful to kind of go through these different techniques is so we can see how far we can push the brush. We can see what all that brush and water and pigment can do. So it's helpful to spend time really focusing in on these different techniques. And you will find that you'll use several of them in the painting process for sure. So just backtracking a little bit to say that. So I have my flat wash example here. How we do a flat wash is I'm going to take my brush. What we do is it's kind of a wet on dry process. You'll hear me talk about wet on wet and wet on dry as we go through this series, especially when we're doing the painting part that's coming up. But this right here, wet on dry, refers to a wet brush on a dry surface. Right. And so what we want to do to get this flat wash, this smooth, no variation plane of color, is we want to use a wet brush. We want to dip it into our pigment and then paint that surface, that dry surface. And that'll give us that flat wash of color. And so to try that out, I'm just going to get my brush nice and wet. Do a blue today. I'm going to cover my brush in that blue pigment. And you can use whichever color you like. But that flat wash is really just that smooth surface, right? Right, that smooth plane. So it's just kind of brushing it across. So you get that smooth surface. That's our flat wash, right? Now to talk a little bit about the kind of the opposite of that is the wet on wet. So that wet on dry is that kind of smooth finish, that one plane of color. That wet on wet, you can see from my example here, that wet on wet gives kind of fun, like a really fun patterning. And so wet on wet is in reference to a wet brush on a wet surface, right? And so to do this one, I'm going to take my brush and get it wet. And I'm going to come back to my blue pigment for this one. I'm going to get my brush wet first and then paint a wet surface. I was getting excited, jumped ahead. So it's a wet surface, wet brush on a wet surface. So what I'm doing is just painting with water to start, right? And then I'm going to go back and get my brush, that pigment on my brush. And you can see the difference, right, between the two. You can paint brush strokes on there. You can do something called tapping, where you're just kind of tapping into it. But you'll see that the water acts differently, right? So when we had just that dry surface, that color spread smoothly across the top. When that surface is wet, you can see that that pigment, that water is taking that pigment in different directions. And so there's darker areas, there are lighter areas. It's just kind of spreading out. It's creating this really organic pattern. This is a technique that I use a lot when I'm creating things like bark on a tree. It gives you that really organic pattern, and you can add extra color to it. So you can see I just did blue here, but maybe I want to add another color. What I can do is just kind of tap it in there. Oh, and you can see that that color is blending. It's taking it out. That water does all the work for us with the wet on wet. How wet should that paper be? Great question. You want a smooth surface of water on it. It doesn't have to be drenching. You don't want that water kind of bleeding out. You want that water contained, right? And so just a small little area covered with water. You want it kind of just a little bit, but you want that whole surface covered. I would encourage you to try it out with different amounts of water too, just to see what those different amounts can do. When it comes to like talking about these different techniques, it's good to kind of play around with it. Try with a whole lot of water, try with a tiny little bit of water, try with a whole lot of pigment, a little bit of pigment. There is like a little element of play and experimentation that happens when it comes to trying out these different techniques. And you can see just as we're talking here that like the water is starting to pool a little bit. And so it's got that darker pigment going to different areas and some lighter pigments. And you can see that red that I added is bleeding out too. It's not a concentrated color. And so hopefully you can see the difference in your own painting, but mine as well. This flat wash is that smooth surface, and that wet on wet has a very organic shape. Right? And so wet on wet is probably my favorite technique to do when I'm doing just like abstract watercolor or like meditative watercolor, because it kind of slows you down and you get to watch that pigment get carried across the surface. And there's something that's really soothing about watching that happen. Sometimes, like when you have too much water, you'll start to see that pigment follow the water. It'll thin out, and so it'll kind of bloom out like that. And that's not bad. That's a technique. That's wet on wet, right? And so one way to avoid it when you're doing a flat wash, honestly, is to practice. It's all about figuring out the right amount of water to have on your brush. And in all honesty, that comes with trying it out and practicing. And that's why like practicing these techniques, like going through and talking about them is helpful, because you're testing that brush. You're seeing how much water works best for each of these techniques, how much water you can have on your brush and still get a flat wash, how much water you have on your brush and you can get this really wonderful blending of color, right? I wish there was like, hold your brush in the water for this many minutes, and you'll get the right amount of water for it. But it really is about like trying it out and getting the feel for it, literally playing, playing with it. So the next process I want to mention or technique is glazing. Glazing, here's an example of that. It's where you're like doing several layers. You're letting each layer dry before you add the next layer. And you can kind of see how it gets darker the more layers. It's the same pigment, right? And you can see here, it's that same pigment, but because it's layered, it's starting to look darker. I've done it all with the same color, but you can do different colors that way as well. So to do a glazing, what we'll do, I'll kind of come over here. And again, definitely try it out too. I'm going to do the blue again, I think. But for the glazing, I'm just going to go ahead and paint a wet on dry square. You want kind of a thin layer of pigment. Okay. I'm just cleaning my brush in between each time. And so for this glazing effect, we're going to let that dry for a moment. I'm going to just write glazing here. Glazing. Glazing works really well. I think that's probably one of the main techniques that we use in watercolor, because watercolor is so translucent, it's transparent. You do several thin layers to build up your painting. So it's not like using acrylic or oil where you really only need that one layer because it's so opaque. Because we're using water, it's kind of thinned out. And so we need layers on top of layers on top of layers to really create our painting. Watercolor is not a fast process. I know I've said that a lot already, but it really is a slowing down process. And I think that's why watercolor, you know, I've shared before, watercolor felt really intimidating to me until I actually sat down and started playing with it. And I realized the water does all the work. And it's actually probably my like favorite art process of all, because it makes me feel good. It helps me slow down because you're literally waiting for the water to dry. So it's like a kind of slowing down process. So we have our first block that I'm doing. It's still a little wet. And again, you want to do these thin layers. You can see it's not like super dark, but it's still that translucent kind of layer. And we're just going to be adding those layers up as it dries. And you use the lightest color for that first layer of glazing? And that's a really great question. So typically when it comes to painting, watercolor specifically, you want to do the lightest color first. And that's because darker colors will be seen when they're on top of the lighter color, but lighter colors won't be seen when they're on top of the darker color. And so if you are doing something that's layered like this, where I have my the same color, but there's kind of a little bit overlapping. So you see just this one square on these parts. You can do the lightest color first. The thing is, when it comes to layering watercolor, because it's so translucent, you're not really going to see, if you're overlapping like this, you're not going to see that, that lightest color. It'll kind of blend in, so you're going to get a new color, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about that in a moment with another process. But it's kind of a way to mix color, blend color as well. So we're going to come back to glazing in a minute because we're going to let our square dry. But our next step our next one that I want to kind of talk about is a graduated wash. And this one does take a little practice to kind of get used to. And I will say, like, sometimes I'm not good at it. I have to try it a couple times. And so again, trying these techniques are really helpful. But a graduated wash is where it's a flat wash of color, but it goes from dark to light. You see that variation. And so like here I have red. I think it was a brilliant red that I was using. And you can see it's a darker on one side. And as I go to the other side, it lightens up. It's a graduated wash. And so to do that, I'm going to get water on my brush. And I'm just going to get some pigment and start. I'm doing red here, one side, right? And just kind of thinning it out, right? So I started with a wet on dry, right? So I'm going to clean my brush and get some water on it and just a little bit of pigment and kind of spread it out, right? And so this one takes a minute because you're adding a little bit of color to one side and you're letting that water kind of carry it across. So again, it's just adding that pigment basically to one side, letting it stay dark on that one side. And let it kind of carry aside or carry across to that lighter edge. Sometimes this requires layering, right? Adding another layer, but it's that smooth kind of transition. All right, and so you can kind of see that kind of pale on one side, that graduation of color from darker to light, and you can add more layers to make it more defined, right? So this is our graduated wash. Let's go back to the glazing for just a moment. Our glazing should be about dry. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer. So glazing, just as a reminder, glazing is a thin layer on top of a thin layer on top of a thin layer on top. It's layers upon layers, right? And so I'm going to get my brush wet. And I'm going to add some red on top. In my example, I only have red here for the glazing. But here, I'm going to just show that red on top. And we don't need a whole lot of pigment on our brush, right? We're starting with the wet on dry, right? And so I'm just going to take that brush and just kind of paint that square. So you can see that overlap causes a color change, right? You only see that red outside where I've painted, right? That blue, where that blue is, you see that's where that color change is happening. So this is called glazing, where you're layering it on top and you're seeing that color change. Here for the red, you could see it was getting darker because I was using that same color. Here, it's changing color because red and blue make purple, right? So I'm getting this lovely shade of purple on the inside. Okay. So that's glazing. And we can come back to it again. Once this layer dries, we can add another layer on top of it. So let's move on to our next technique. So an example of this is feathering. And here's an example right here. You can see I drew a heart, right? This is my image. Feathering is where you have, it's kind of like the graduated wash. You have a really dark around the edges and it fades out the further away you get. And so my heart here, it's really dark around the outside of the heart, but you can see that wash is kind of fading out. It's going from saturated to faded the further away it gets. And so feathering is something, it's not like the easiest process. It takes me a while to get it right. But when you use it, it looks so good. And so it's nice when you're painting like organic shapes like flowers or organic objects like flowers or leaves, things like that. You can get those darker areas that helps show like when there's more light or shadow, and then fading that color out can um, really add to your painting that way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a little circle here, and that's going to be my object, right? And so for feathering, what I'm going to do is get my brush wet. I'm going to go back to my blue here. And I'm going to start off by kind of going around the shape. You see in my drawing, it was a heart. It can be a square, it can be a tree, whatever shape that is. And I'm starting with the wet on dry. And then getting my brush wet and kind of coming back through and going around, carrying that darker pigment out, right? I'm not really adding more pigment, right? I'm just taking that water and letting it pull that pigment. Okay. So it's creating this kind of feathered look where it's really dark around the edge and lighter the further out it goes. One of the things that you can do, if you notice like on mine here, you can see it's darker towards the bottom, that it's kind of fading out here. I can go back through with like a wet brush and get a little pigment and just kind of come back through and add that darker pigment there. It's not something you have to do with one swipe at all. It can be, again, layers on layers on layers, right? Again, it's not a fast process. It really is kind of a slowing down and just kind of experimenting with it. Sometimes it takes a while to get used to it. And again, it really is about like doing a couple versions of this and getting used to how much water, right? How much water to use. And so again, when I was doing this, I started with a wet on dry. I had my brush was full of pigment and I went around the outside, right? And then I cleaned my brush, put it in some water and just pulled that pigment out to the edges, right? So it's not that I'm doing like changing up techniques, but I'm thinking about how wet my brush is and how much pigment I'm putting on my brush. Okay. And so again, for the feathering, it was using wet on dry with the pigment, loading my brush up with pigment, going around the outside, and then cleaning my brush and coming back through with some water to pull that pigment out to the edges. And so that's called feathering. The next technique I want to talk about is lifting. This one is a great technique for painting, but it's also one of those techniques where, like, if you have too much pigment or too much water, this is one way to pull that pigment up. And so it's also a great way to kind of add highlights to your painting as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do with a wet on dry. Again, I'm just going to get my brush wet and I'm going to start on dry paper, but I'm going to get my brush wet. I'm going to do some purple now, change it up a little bit. Get my brush covered in the pigment, and I'm just going to kind of paint a square. Right. So let's say, like I got too much pigment, too much water here. What I can do is lift some of that pigment and water up. And again, this is like really great if you get too much water on there and you want to pull some of that water up, or if you've got the pigment on there too dark and you want to lift some of that pigment up. So I'm going to take my brush, I'm just going to kind of dry it a little bit and then press it into that surface. And you see it can pick up some of that pigment. So I'm just I painted that square, right? And so I'm just taking my brush and just picking some of that up. You can paint that way. I use this when I'm doing like painting flowers and I want to add a highlight, or if I'm painting faces and I want to kind of pick some of that pigment up. You do it while it's still wet, right? So you're picking some of that pigment up while it's still a little wet. When your pigment is dry, you can still do lifting like this. I'm going to come over to our flat wash here and show you. So my flat wash is dry. Let's say I wanted a highlight in my corner here. So what I can do is take my brush and get it nice and wet, and then add, like, let's say I didn't want this mark here. I need this mark to come up. I can add water to it. Not pigment, just adding water, and it kind of pulls it up, and I can dry my brush and pick up that pigment. So it's not like completely erasing that color, right? Because you'll still see that shadow of the color there, right? But it's one way to kind of pick up something that overflows a little bit, or if it's too saturated, it's a way to pull up some of that pigment, or if there's too much water. It's picking up some pigment, picking up that water. And you can do it wet on wet, just like I did here. Or if the painting is dry, you can add clean water to it and just kind of brush it back and forth and then pick up that pigment that way with a dry brush. So scumbling is all about making these broken, like scratchy marks, layering it up. I use this one a lot when I'm doing like a bunch of leaves on a tree or grass. It's a way to add layers. And hopefully you can see with this one that there are several layers of that same pigment. You can do it with a brush like I did here, or this is where you can bring in things like sponges to get that same kind of mark making. And so I'll kind of show how to do that as well. So for scumbling, what you want to do is kind of make that first layer, right? That flat wash to start with. And so I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm going to do some green. I'm going to get some green on my brush. I'm just going to kind of paint that square, sort of square. Right. So I've got my first layer there. We're going to let that dry and come back to it in a minute. While that's drying, let's talk about that next technique. We'll come back to this one. So dry brush. This is, we talked about wet on dry and wet on wet. This is basically dry on dry. This is also another great one to do like grass, if you're doing like wood lines, like stone. It gives you kind of this natural line work that you're working with. It's good for hair, doing hair, but you can see there's a lot of individual marks here, right? So to do that dry brush, like I said, the dry brush is dry on dry. So you're basically starting out with a mostly dry brush and a completely dry paper. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a flat brush and I'm just going to get it a little wet and then just kind of dry it on my paper towel. I need it mostly dry, right? But we still need water because watercolor needs water. So we're getting it mostly dry. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hand, my finger and my thumb, and I'm just going to kind of press those bristles, right? So it kind of fans out a little bit. I'm going to dip it in my pigment. Okay, so I've got it fanned out, right? And it's all about making those marks. Dry on dry, right? So you're starting to see those lines appear, right? You can do it with a round brush as well, getting it mostly dry, right? Dipping it in that pigment and then fanning it out, right? You see them fanning out. And you're seeing those lines, right? You can do it with a fan brush. It's already fanned out, so that makes it really nice. A round brush, flat brush, a filbert, any brush works with this, but it's all about that dry paper, starting with that dry paper and a mostly dry brush. And so it's giving this kind of scratchy line work. Now I did the dry brush on a white background, but you can do a dry brush on top of a flat wash or a wet on wet. A lot of these techniques you can layer, okay? Which is nice. So let's come back to Scumbling. It's mostly dry, so I'm going to kind of talk about that for a minute. So Scumbling, to go back to Scumbling, that's the scratchy layers upon layers. And so one of the things that I can do, now that my flat wash is mostly dry, I'm going to get my brush wet and add a little bit of pigment. So I'm not wetting my surface again. I'm just taking that pigment, right, and just kind of adding it on top. Okay. Not getting that surface wet, but just kind of doing that dry on top, layering. And once that dries, I can do another layer. I did a different layer just so it was, or a different color, so it was a little easier to see. But with this red, I did the same color. So it's the same red on top of the same red on top of the same red. This one is a green with a different green on top. So it's just so you can see the two different ways to do it. Now I mentioned Scumbling, you can also use a sponge. What you can do is take your sponge, and I'm just going to kind of dip it into my water and squeeze it out. Okay. So my sponge is really flexible. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is come over. I got my wet sponge. I'm going to dip it in my pigment, right? So you can see the pigment on the sponge. Okay. And then I can come over here and press it into it. Okay. So you can see it's adding that other layer. So it's a different type of like look than the brush, but it's still that speckled kind of scratchy look, right? And so you can play around with different types of sponges. This is like more of the natural looking sponge that I'm using, but you can use like regular sponges too. Any kind of sponge will work for this. It's because it's so porous, it gives you a really fun design, right? Really fun pattern. And you can just do multiple layers. So I'm going to add another layer. Okay. And you can build up those layers. We're going to talk about those additives, different techniques where we bring extra things in to kind of change the texture and look of our pigment. And so the first one I want to talk about is salt. So using the salt gives a really nice kind of crystallized texture. And this is a really fun process, I think, to do, especially when it comes to like a meditative process, because you can watch that salt really soak up the water, which is just a really nice look, basically. I like using salt for two reasons. One, it creates this really like lovely crystallized texture. And two, it helps my painting dry quickly. And that's because it does soak up that water. I'm going to do just a regular blue pigment here, but what I'm going to do is a wet on dry, but know that you can do a wet on wet as well. It doesn't have to be the wet on dry. But what I'm going to do is just kind of add that pigment. Clean my brush. And then take salt, and this is regular table salt, right? Take salt and just sprinkle that salt on. You can already see that salt that I've added has started soaking up some of that water. And so what it does is it soaks up that water and leaves that lovely crystallized pattern behind. You can do more colors on top of this. You can do layers on top of this, layers of the same color on top of it. But it does give us that really nice texture. Once this dries, we can brush that salt off and it leaves this pattern behind. Right? That's really nice. Another really great thing that you can kind of add in with this process are things like saran wrap, or isopropyl alcohol, or actual alcohol. You can bring in those different supplies and they change the texture and look of your pigment. So if I were doing this process and wanting to bring like a sheet of saran wrap or cling wrap in, while it's still wet, I can crumple up that saran wrap and press it on top. And then once it dries completely, pull off that saran wrap and you'll get this really nice texture. And so when it comes to like this additive, we're talking about salt specifically today, but there are so many other supplies that you can bring in and really change the look of the watercolor. So I know I've said it before, and I'll probably say it more times as we go through this series. But when it comes to watercolor, there's an element of play and experimentation that is kind of involved in it. And I think doing something like this type of additive, can really invite a lot of play, figuring out these different supplies that you can bring in to change that texture and look. All right, so the next one I want to talk about is shaving. And this one is using like a flat wash and then shaving some watercolor pencil on top of it. We talked about watercolor pencil not that long ago. Watercolor pencil is really nice because it's water soluble. And so when you use that and add water to it, that water kind of blends into that pigment and you get a really nice look. When you're shaving it on top, you get this really wonderful speckled look. That's really nice. And so I'll show us kind of how to do that as well. So I'm going to grab a watercolor pencil here. I'm going to do purple, whatever. We'll do a green. Yeah. And then some sandpaper. And this sandpaper I'm using is a fine grain of sandpaper. It's, I think 150 is the grain, but you can go in, like if you're in a drawing section of like an art store, they'll have something that looks like this. It's several sheets of sandpaper that are stapled on this piece of like masonite or wood. This is perfect for using that shaving, but also just going into like a Walmart or a regular like hardware store, you can get regular sandpaper. You just want that fine grain of sandpaper. And so what we'll do to kind of use that shaving, create that shaving, is again, get our brush nice and wet. And I'm going to use some orange on my brush here. And I'm just going to put some pigment, a wet brush on that dry surface. Clean my brush. And then to add that shaving, I'm just going to take my watercolor pencil and just kind of shave it on that sandpaper. And what you can see is that that shaving is starting to get into that pigment, that wet pigment that's there. And just kind of like adding some of that shading. Once it dries, right, you'll have this really nice speckled look. It's really helpful, I found, for doing like animal skin, like things for like rhinos or elephants. It's really helpful doing rocks or like parts of mountains. It's helpful for grass, creating grass, but also doing things like bird eggs. It's kind of a fun one to play around with for sure. The last additive I want to talk about is masking. And so masking is kind of a resist painting. There's something called a masking fluid that you can get that you can put on your paper and then paint. And when it dries, you can peel that masking fluid off. I'll show how to use that. But you can also use a wax crayon. I've got a white crayon here, just a regular Crayola crayon. But you can use other colors as well. The benefit of using a white one is that it doesn't show up because you're not able to pull that wax off after you paint like you are with the masking fluid, but it still does the same thing. It's a resist type painting. And so to do that, to masking fluid, I'm just going to kind of shake that up, open that masking fluid. So you can see that masking fluid is kind of a creamy color, right? It's not super thick, but I'll dip my brush in. And if you're using masking fluid, I would suggest not using a watercolor brush to pull it out. Just a regular, like any kind of brush, cheap brush works. I use this one over and over again for masking fluid, but what I can do is just kind of make that mark. And once that dries, I can paint watercolor over it. I can also do, like I said, that wax crayon and just kind of press into it. To create that same type of mark, right? And so for the sake of time, I have an example over here of that masking fluid that I already put down and that wax crayon. And so what I would do, again, is getting my brush nice and wet. And I'm going to do that orange again, but just kind of paint that across. And you can see where that masking fluid is and where that wax crayon is. That paint is staying away from it, right? And it's because that masking fluid, that crayon, they create that kind of covering. So it's not, the paint is not staying there. Once this paint dries, I can just kind of gently roll my finger across that masking fluid and peel it up. So once that pigment dries, you're able to just kind of rub that masking fluid off. You can do that by using a little eraser or your finger. And I'll just take my finger and kind of roll. You can see it's kind of coming up a little bit. And you have that resist, that white spot. And so I do want to say thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask or email us at our contact@Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.